Okay, he's responsible for building out Risk.io's predictive analytics functionality and has been selected to speak at some of the top information security events on this topic. And he'll fill you in with a little bit more about himself. Welcome, Michael Roytman, everybody.
So in all seriousness, if anybody here is not interested in metrics or vulnerability management, this is your chance. You should leave. That is what this talk is about. At a higher level, this talk is about automation, not just in security, but in IT in general. And we get pretty specific. I pull out a data set of about 150 million live breach events. So by breach events, I mean technical exploitations that are successful of a machine, not necessarily loss of data. And I'll use those to analyze what makes a good strategy, what makes a bad strategy, and how do we determine what's good and what's bad. So I dropped out of a PhD in game theory, and I've been working at Risk.io doing kind of descriptive and predictive analytics for some time now. And this is essentially what I've learned in that time. This is by no means the Risk.io product. This is just the data that we get from users, which is tons and tons of vulnerability scans from Qualys, Rapid7, McAfee, all over the place. And I can correlate those together and look at them in the aggregate. It's around 250 million live vulnerabilities across 1 million assets. And then the other data set that I have is a bunch of threat intelligence partners, and that's the breach events. So let's get started. So anybody take an Uber here? Anybody take Ubers usually? So why do you prefer an Uber over a cab?
They're a lot faster, and I can tell exactly when they're going to arrive. I know who it's going to be.
Right, those are perfect answers. Those are like the metrics as to why Uber is more successful as an enterprise than a taxi service. Because if you think about it, in 2005, a taxi was really good at their job. They had metrics like average driver runtime, number of pickups per day. They would optimize those. Those people weren't dumb or bad at their jobs. It's just that they were missing an essential piece of data that got us to the Uber state. And this came out around 5 or 6 years ago, which was everybody had a smartphone, everybody had their location. So all of a sudden, a pickup was no longer defined as let me drive around looking for somebody. It was, you know, both the origination and the endpoint of the customer. Now you have all sorts of different metrics, like metrics about the customer themselves. How quickly did the customer get to their destination? How convenient is it? How efficient are they? And those only became possible. It only became possible to measure that kind of activity once the new data set of locations came out. And I think in security we're at the same kind of juncture, where we have been doing a really good job with the data that we have, but all of a sudden there's an explosion of new types of data, namely exploitation data, successful exploitation data from IDS logs and from vulnerability scanners. And we're not using that data to guide strategy or to guide prioritization of vulnerability management. And the end result is that attackers are just better at automation. They're faster. They don't have bureaucracies to deal with, and they use all the data they have at their disposal. Namely, the data that they use is they know when they are successful, and they continue to undertake those attacks. So, data dump number 1. This is 100 million breach events over 2014. They're all sorted by CVE. The size of the bubble is the amount of breaches on that particular CVE. And let's stop here and define what a breach is in my world. A breach is a technical successful exploitation. And I get those one of two ways. Either a machine exists and an IDS picked up an exploit signature. That exploit signature was fired off against the machine. There was no mitigating control. And from a separate data source, I know that at that timestamp, there was an open vulnerability corresponding to that exploit on that machine. So it was hit. It was successfully hit. Now, did they steal a PDF of the lunch menu of a Subway shop? I don't know. But that doesn't really matter. That allows me to train the base rate probabilities of exploitation across all the CVEs and figure out which ones are being used successfully and being used successfully time and time again over time. And when you look at that, two patterns emerge really clearly. The first is that only a small subset of those CVEs, and there's more on this in this year's Verizon DBAR, it uses the same data set. Only a really small subset, about 20, account for something like 99.9% of the breach volume. That is, attackers know which CVEs they're most successful at, and largely these are end-of-life systems, things that can be patched, and if they find a scan of one, then they know that they can hit it using that exploit. And they can guarantee the success of that exploit. So they're measuring how well they're doing when they're firing off those Metasploit modules against people, and they continue to time and time again use the ones that are successful. The second thing that becomes really apparent is if you look at the numbers here, all of them are over a year old. I think only Poodle is the kind of newish one that has some substantial traffic. The rest are 2002, 2012, there's a 99 SMTP vulnerability in there. 2001. And that's because those exploits are stable, they're automated, and we know how they interact with the real-life threat environment. And by we now, I mean attackers. So attackers know when they fire off an exploit what defenses are possible, how that's going to perform in the wild. So that's why they continue to use those exploits. A less simplistic view of this would be to break it up by quarter, and the same pattern starts to emerge with a little variation in that they're changing up their tactics once in a while, but those two patterns still stay true. A small number of CVEs are responsible for most of the breach events, and most of them are pretty old. They're not Patch Tuesday vulnerabilities. So what do we need to do to catch up? We need better automations ourselves. In fact, what we need to do is we need to free up some space in order to be able to make decisions faster than the attackers make decisions. And the best enterprises of vulnerability management, places like Etsy and Netflix, are places that can respond kind of asynchronously and in real time and change up their strategies in real time because most of it is automated away. So here's current vulnerability management. We have automated vuln discovery. That's a scanner, and everybody uses a scanner. We have manual to automated vuln scanning. So some people are scanning continuously. Some people aren't because there's business processes involved. Some people aren't because they just don't set up weekly scans. We have really manual threat intelligence. And I say this, I have access to iDefense, iSight, Dell Counter Threat Unit, and I read those. That's my daily job. And all of those are reports typed up by people that tell you about the activity of something malicious. That's not automated in any way. That's not consumable. And to make it consumable, I go through horrible neurolinguistic programming exercises and find packages and try to mine out CVEs and figure out if that's related to this. That shouldn't be the case. That kind of threat intelligence, in order to be able to make decisions about vulnerability prioritization specifically, needs to be automated. And the last thing is kind of the correlation of all these things. It's that our prioritization and our scoring of vulnerabilities is incredibly manual. If you think about CVSS itself, CVSS 2 or 3 or 1, the way that we figure out a score is a vulnerability comes out, and an analyst at MITRE or NIST comes up with a description of that vulnerability. And some of that data is super useful, like what's the confidentiality impact or what's the integrity impact. But all of that is a point-in-time assessment done when the vulnerability is released. 6 months later, a new exploit might come out, or people might start using that vulnerability more often in a different fashion, and the score never accounts for that real-time threat environment. So how do we do that? How do we stop these manual processes? We need better data. We need better base rates for exploitation of vulnerabilities. That much is obvious. We need better exploit availability data. So Shodan does a pretty good job of mining exploit deep and Metasploit, and you can write some custom scripts, and I think just about everybody I know in vulnerability management has written some custom scripts around Shodan. It's not standardized in any way. But that's only a small piece of the pie. We also need the Black Hat exploit kits that have CVEs in them but aren't being reported out as this CVE is more important because there's a Black Hat exploit kit related to it that's being actively used and costs $100 to pop a system. We need better trends about which vulnerabilities are out in the wild, because if we think about what attackers are automating, they're scanning large systems, they're figuring out where they are vulnerable, and they're attacking the things that are most likely to be successful, that have the most of that type of vulnerability around them. If we can know that in general, the population of Adobe Flash vulnerabilities, this one particular version is the one that has the most vulnerabilities out there in the wild, that's what attackers are going to be going after, because there's an incentive for them to attack the thing that will be most successful time and time again. We need better breach data itself. So every year we look at the Verizon DBIR, and every year we think, well, there are these types of attack vectors, and these things are hacking, and these breaches were really bad. But how did they get in is a question we rarely ask, and it's a question that we might ask at the individual business level and answer for ourselves, but globally, very few people are undertaking figuring out what is causing those breaches and whether there's a repeatable pattern that we should be defending against before we move on to the more targeted attacks. And all of this really comes down to we need better metrics. So metrics is this nebulous word that people use to say you do analytics or you know the maths. In reality, metrics are just ways to turn decisions into numbers. Metrics should be a good metric should be a guide for decision support. Sometimes you might have a bad metric, sometimes you might have a bad decision, but that metric should be able to measure how good your decision was, how bad your decision was, and you should be able to base your decisions on that. Specifically in our context, I mean, do I fix this vulnerability or do I fix this vulnerability with my limited resources? So a good metric, and this is contentious, and we should have a Q&A about this. People can ask and we can debate it out. My contention here is that a good metric is just an objective function for automation. That is, a good metric is a solution to a problem that can be solved with data and numbers, but hasn't been solved yet. So the reason that you're coming up with the metric is because you want to be able to make some kind of decision time and time again based on something repeatable and quantitative. And as soon as you've done that, that means you can write a script about it that will make that decision automatically. And if you can't, you have a bad metric. So what makes a metric good? Let's take a step back and look at what makes a metric bad. Here are two vulnerabilities. This is from the release date of Heartbleed. Each of those circles represents a time bucket of about 3 hours. And in that time bucket, how many successful exploitations on that vulnerability did I find? So for Heartbleed, the size of the bubble correlates to the volume of breach exploitation. And that gap is bad code writing. It's missing data. It's not. Actually, nobody was exploiting Heartbleed for a month. So you can see that at the beginning, Heartbleed is attacked once or twice every 3 hours. Maybe I'm tracking 10 exploitations. By the end of it, a couple months out, reverse Heartbleed comes out, and I'm starting to see dozens of exploitations, hundreds of exploitations per hour. If you look at Shellshock, which is a CVSS 10, compared to Heartbleed, very few exploitations as soon as it comes out, and this makes sense because they're still ramping up their ability to exploit that vulnerability. If we zoom out a little bit further and take a look at Poodle's release, instantly, as soon as Poodle was released, everybody's popping this thing. It's because it's super easy to exploit. Now, look at the CVSS scores for those things. Poodle and Heartbleed are below CVSS 5. Shellshock is a CVSS 10, but it pales in comparison to the breach exploitation traffic. And that's because CVSS is not accounting for that real-life threat environment. It's describing the vulnerability. It's not telling you whether that vulnerability is actually being used in the wild. So this is all great, and these logos are awesome and easy to understand, but let's take a step back at not logoed vulnerabilities. So if I do a cluster analysis on the CVSS properties of Heartbleed, which is score under 5, information disclosure, integrity impact, and I look at other vulnerabilities that are similar to it, I find 4 that have impressively more live breach traffic time and time again. And these 4 are things that don't have logos that you don't think about. And this is essentially what we want our metrics to capture. We want our metrics to be able to find the Java runtime 2013 vulnerability that is constantly being hit in this data set and not prioritize something because it has a logo or prioritize something because its CVSS scores 10. Because in reality, when your scan data comes back, it'll tell you this is a medium or high criticality vulnerability. It'll tell you to ignore Heartbleed. And it won't tell you anything about CVE 2013, 24, 23 because it's CVSS 5. In reality, if you have that, you're probably getting hit on it constantly because everybody's scanning the internet and attacking it. That Windows 2000 vulnerability you see over there has persistently been always exploited in our data set, and that's because it's an end-of-life product. If you have that, there's no support, there's no mitigating control against that vulnerability, and people know this. The data set, also a good time to explain this, comes from about 70,000 businesses, and I'm getting the IDS and vuln data as well as the mitigating control data from the Alien Vault Threat Exchange, Dell SecureWorks Counter Threat Unit, VeriSign iDefense, and kind of percolating it through this logic of, is there an exploit that hit it? Is the vulnerability open? Is there no mitigating control? That's a hit. And so what we learn here is not actually that CVSS is problematic. CVSS is a description of a vulnerability. It is not by any means meant to be a metric for prioritization. And this becomes incredibly apparent when you try to use it to do predictions. So this is a logistic regression of a CVSS score as predictive of the volume of exploitation on a vulnerability. So at the very top, you see things that are exploited 100 to 1,000,000 times, and the rest are smaller buckets, 100 to 10, 135 to 8, or whatever, 8 to 2. And these are kind of the buckets that I've assigned and defined as, this attack is probably automated. This is probably running a Metasploit module time and time again. And the bottom ones are probably, these are targeted things. If in a data set of 70,000 businesses, I'm only seeing 1 or 2 successful hits on that vulnerability, that was probably a very targeted crafted attack. And so what's important to notice here is that if you look at the scores that predict large or low volume, the difference between those scores is like 0.3. That means that the granularity that CVSS tries to promise you in doing scan analysis is non-existent. At best, you tend a little bit more towards being able to pick up on the stuff that matters. In reality, the difference between that is maybe the 10s are slightly more descriptive because people care about the 10s because attackers are reading about the 10s. But everything else in there, the 8s, the 9s, they're not very important, or they're not very predictive of actual in the wild exploitation. I'll get into this more richly, or I think more succinctly at the end of the talk as well. The reason for this is that attackers, is this working? Is this working? Yes. Is that attackers change their tactics daily. So what you're seeing here is a snapshot of that same data, but represented in a different way. This is 3 months, week over week, of that attack data. Each of the circles, the yellows are things that aren't confirmed exploitations. The reds are ones that did have an open vulnerability and did get hit. Each of those is a separate CVE, and each of those is mapped for its weekly volume. So the size of the bubble is its weekly volume. And on the right-hand side are things that are getting hit millions of times. In the middle are things that are getting hit 1,000 to 10,000 times. The left-hand side are things that are getting hit once or twice in the week. So maybe I'm wrong here, but my assumption is that the things that are getting hit hundreds of thousands of times are automated attacks. Those are targeted attacks. And then you can see week over week, it's logarithmically scaled, but the things that are popping in that are new for that week that didn't exist in the previous week are at the top. And then the things that are dropping out that were attacked the week before but not are at the bottom. And what this really just shows you is how much it changes. So like some automated attacks consistently stay automated. And that's why that first graphic I showed you displays the kind of tendency of the Pareto law distribution of most things. Only 20 or so things account for most of it. But the small targeted attacks are changing all the time. And unless you have data that captures what's happening that particular week, your metric is not going to be able to capture it. CVSS certainly makes no effort to do so. Your scanners certainly make no effort to do so. It is the job of your vulnerability management strategy to be able to do so, and that's what makes good metrics in this field. So what defines a good metric? It's good data. But I don't think that's enough. That's right. So which of these assets is more secure? Question for the audience. Yeah. So I heard asset 2, I heard asset 1. It's a philosophical choice, right? It's certainly not asset 2. But the reason is either they're equally secure because the control is equally effective at protecting attacks, or asset 1 is more secure because there's less value at risk and attackers are less likely to go after it. And so this type of philosophical choice actually really succinctly illustrates the difference between using CVSS for your prioritization strategy and using some real-time threat intelligence data baked into it. Here's the difference. CVSS is not describing the outside threat environment that the asset exists in. When you use a metric that incorporates, say, the value of the asset or some intelligence about what's happening in the real world, you're saying, I suspect attackers will behave a certain way. And there are these two types of metrics. This, and I have a bunch of references at the end, this is by no means for security. This is just like metrics in general. Biostatisticians use this all the time. There's a type 1 metric and a type 2 metric. I don't know why I made these pop up separately. Type 1 metrics are metrics that exclude the real-life threat environment. They're metrics like CVSS, and they're actually super useful because you control the occurrence rate of something. So there's, I don't know the names, but there's a bunch of good startups now that are kind of simulating phishing emails, and they send them out to your entire enterprise. And they're like, well, this percentage clicked. That's awesome. That's great. That's really useful for you to know the base rate of simulated phishing in your industry. But it tells you nothing about an actual phishing email because that phishing email is crafted much more specifically, can be dynamic, and has a real-life threat environment in it. You need both types of metrics to be able to make decisions well because you need to be able to describe, say, the people that work at your place of origin and the phishing emails that are constantly coming in. But you need to supplement it with a type 2 metric, which is in interaction with the threat environment. It describes the rate of undesired events. So kind of the gaps that I've showed you between Heartbleed being a 5.0 and it being exploited a lot is exactly that. On a type 2 metric, Heartbleed is super important because everybody's attacking it. On a type 1 metric, if we exclude the real-life threat environment, it is not that important. It is just an information disclosure and nobody cares about it. When you combine those two metrics, you're finally able to make a good decision about whether or not you should remediate that vulnerability over something else. And so I posit that we're in a space where we can now get type 2 metrics. We already have the type 1 metrics, and we can combine the two to make some good decisions. Yes? Yeah, I think so. I mean, so you have the same controls protecting a golden duck and a normal duck. You probably want. Is your question that you? Yeah, I mean, I would have 10 different controls on asset too. I mean, it depends on how you want to spend your money, right? Some people might say, no, this is fine. I've implemented a control against all my assets and my baseline level of security is this. I can measure it. I personally disagree with that approach because there's 2 orders of magnitude or 3 orders of magnitude baked into the difference in value. So you might want at least 1 order of magnitude of difference in controls, but maybe that's not possible to implement. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, insurance is just a control. If you're thinking about this as a game, like who cares if you get popped if you have insurance? They do not cover bike theft. I recently found that out personally. Yeah, they like scale your deductible by an order of magnitude if you're reporting stolen bikes for some reason. So there are some really good scientific definitions of what makes a good metric. Not in security, in like the world of statistics and biology. People have metrics that they think are good. Metrics need to be bounded, meaning that you need to be able to have an end and a start to the metric. If you don't have an end and a start, you can't make decisions because that decision could, there's no difference between something that's at infinity or at 100,000 if your metric has no bound. They need to scale metrically. And what that really means is that the difference between a CVSS 8 and a CVSS 9 needs to have an explanation that I can put in words, and I don't think any of us can. So to say that maybe it's an order of magnitude more at risk if this vulnerability is a 9 versus an 8 would be really cool, right? Like we're constantly going up and we know that we fix the tens first and the rest are an order of magnitude less. That's just not true in that metric. To say that it's 1 point more or 10% more at risk would also be really cool, but that's not true. So what we really want to do is we want to design metrics that have meaning between the differences in their numbers, right? So it can be on a scale of 0.1 to 0.2 as long as you can tell me what each one of those decimals in between is actually indicating about the thing you're describing. Objective, valid, and reliable are really scientific terms. So it's about function bijections and surjections. If you put in the same data should come out. If the data is, if there's 2 different data points that are describing different things, they should pump out different things. And they should repeat time and time again. They should pump out the same thing if you're inputting the same data. Context specific is a strange one, but essentially it means your metric should be describing something, should be describing the action. It's like the difference between what I said. CVSS is not a bad metric. It's just not a metric for prioritization. It was never intended to describe your decision-making calculus of this vulnerability or this vulnerability. I'll show you an example of a metric that's really stupid and simple, but is one that is context-specific to making a decision, and it'll become apparent. And number 7 is one I tacked on myself, computed automatically, because we live in a world where we want to be faster than attackers, and if those metrics aren't computed automatically, the volume of decisions that we have to make is far too big for these metrics to be any useful. Case in point being, I buy the iDefense feed. It's a really great feed. If it's not automated, if I don't have scripts running on it that are pumping out data, I can't consume it because there's just me, and I can't keep reading hundreds of files every day. So here's a metric, and we could make this an audience question as well. Here's a metric that we use all the time. Is this metric a valid, good metric? Is this a metric that you should use for decision making? Mean time to incident discovery. The next slide will give my answer, but anybody want to take a stab at this one? You don't even have to think about these things. Just tell me, do you use this in your incident response? Is this something that you use to, I don't know, grade your incident responders or your enterprise?
Hi, Geek here. Sorry about this. We had another audio freeze up. So we have no audio and no speaker movement until about the 33-minute mark. Sorry for the issue.
hit this many times. And to figure out the probability that you'll be breached on an open vulnerability, what I take are the total open vulnerabilities, so that 250 million, and I slice out only the ones of the live ones which have correlated breach events to them. So my type 2 metric here is that real-life threat environment. It's the breach data. My type 1 metric here is the controlled occurrence rate of, in the real world, people have this many open vulnerabilities. These are two very different data sets. Combining them is probably crazy, but when we're talking about hundreds of millions of things, you might get some insight out of that kind of combination. So if you take a dart and you throw it at one of the 65,000 vulnerabilities in the National Vulnerability Database, the probability that you are remediating one that has an associated breach event on it scaled by the live occurrence rate of that vulnerability is 6%. That's actually pretty good, right? Like if you're just randomly picking a vulnerability, you're 5% likely to be successful. The reason for that is because, first of all, everybody has Flash or everybody has Chrome vulnerabilities, and when those get hit, the scaling parameter of the live occurrences of those just explodes the probability of your success. So if you hit that one, you're very likely to be successful. And the other reason is because nobody has like the PHP my admin vulnerabilities in my scan data because I have enterprise scan data. I don't have gambling websites, whatever. But we can do a lot better than 6%. First, let's check out CVSS. So here's the way this graph works. It's not very intuitive. Say you pick one of those values. I'm sick as a dog. But we're going to get through this. There's 5 more slides. Say you pick the 0. What this graph says is, if I pick vulnerabilities that have a CVSS score of 0 or above at random, what's the probability that I'm successful in remediating a vulnerability that has an associated breach event? And everything is 0 or above, so that is the 6% that you saw earlier. It's 6.2. If you pick everything that's 1 or above, so you're slicing out the zeros, or 2 or above, you're slicing out the 1s and the zeros, that kind of stays constant until you hit 5. And it goes up a little bit. So the kind of, in fraud detection, you'd call this a false positive, false negative rate. There's a cutoff rate at which like it makes sense to undertake the action. And that is 10 here, right? If you're just remediating the 10s, you're about 12% successful. You're twice as good as random. And there's still a really large number of 10s, so it's not like you're only fixing 2 vulnerabilities. In reality, that cutoff is done as like a round, so the 9.5s don't enter into that, nothing of that sort. The 9s are also fairly good, right? It's 9%. It's like a 50% increase over random. So what this tells you, take a step back, is that only fixing the critical stuff, the stuff your scanner tells you, which is 8 and above by every scanner's definition, is not actually all that much better than random. You're at the average of 8, 9, and 10, which is what, like 9%? But if you're fixing only the 10s, that's a really simple, basic step that you can take to increase the efficiency of your program. I guarantee you there's no chance everybody has every 10 remediated. I have seen hundreds of scan data from fancy enterprises, and all of them still have CVSS 10 vulnerabilities out there in thrones. But what this also tells you is that CVSS is kind of binary. It's like at the top of the scale, we know that stuff is significant at identifying stuff that's likely to be breached. But the rest of it is a crapshoot. The rest of it isn't really that descriptive of a decision in any way. And I've been saying this analytically, but this is a kind of empirical proof of the same thing. So is my crazy Metasploiter not metric any better? And the answer is yes, it's a hell of a lot better. CVSS 10 does twice as good as well as good as. Right? If you pick a vulnerability that has an entry in Metasploit DB, randomly, just throw a dart at it, then the probability that you're remediating something that has associated breach events on it is 17.5%. It's way better than CVSS 10. It's a lot better than random. The reason for this is really simple. It's that metric is descriptive of a property of a vulnerability that actually correlates to it being exploited, right? It has an exploit that is maybe a proof of concept, but it still exists. Chances are you're going to hit something. If you randomly pick a Metasploit vulnerability, you're at 27.5% chance. And if you take the intersection of the two, that is, first somebody reported a proof of concept or really maybe a stable exploit, then that was turned into a Metasploit, you're at a 36% chance of remediating something that has an associated breach event in it in the past year. And this is empirical proof that a valid metric is better decision-making calculus. It's also empirical proof that if you just think about what it is that you're trying to do, which is stop the likelihood of breaches by remediating some vulnerabilities, then you should pick factors that are descriptive of it and not trust your scanner randomly. That's it. we have jobs if anybody wants jobs. And then there are 2 slides of references about metrics in biology and epidemiology and a whole lot in security. There was a conference in Germany about a year ago that is really awesome, and they have like 10 papers. That is most of where I get my ideas from. Questions, thoughts, discussions, criticisms? Do you want to go back, forward? I will post all of this stuff. Start with the Dan Gear full day tutorial, because that man is a genius. Across all of them. Really awesome question. A whole lot of them are CVSS 4, 5, and 7. The reason for that is not because there's something specific about 4, 5, and 7. It's because the way the combinations of CVSS factors fall onto the 0 to 10 map, those are descriptive of information disclosure vulnerabilities and access complexity low vulnerabilities that don't have confirmed exploits. But if you're finding it in Metasploit, it already has a confirmed exploit, so that's the thing that that's the thing that CVSS 10 is missing, I guess. And it's actually pretty evenly distributed between, if you just like look at Metasploit and score that distribution, it's pretty evenly distributed amongst 4, 5, there's a huge uptick, 7, there's a huge uptick, and then of course the 10's better as well. So I wrote a Python script from Shodan. It's pretty easy to do. Shodan, they require an API key, but inside baseball, you don't actually have to use it. You can just kind of bypass it and go to the next search, and then return a list of stuff that has Metasploits on it. Rapid7 themselves, if you are buying their scanner, certainly has that data available and will overlay it. Yeah. Heads up though, so like I get all of those scans, and some are better than others. I'm not allowed to say because we have partnerships with them, but the rate at which you pull Metasploit and the rate at which Metasploit is updated is not the same as the rate at which those scanners get that data. Some of them do it in a manual process where it's like their analyst will then, as they're typing up their custom score or whatever, will go research something online, and some of those analysts are really bad. Shodan is pretty reliable at getting the actual like get source data from Metasploit. ExploitDB is more of a crapshoot because it's just a less kind of precise tool. It's very hard to tell whether or not the exploit in ExploitDB is actually being used or is one that can be used, but it's the presence of something there is also a great corollary to breach events. There is a CVSS version 3 coming out. I have done a lot of reading about it. It has some really awesome things in it, like, is this vulnerability chained with another one? It has things like, the schema for it is a really good description of vulnerabilities, and it would be really awesome if we had that data, but in reality, and I've talked to the people that are releasing it, in reality, there are 65,000 vulnerabilities that exist today that need to be backfilled for that data, for that to be useful in any kind of analysis, and they have no plans of doing so. They're trying to get NSF to fund graduate students to do that manual work of importing that data and doing the analysis, but if you're getting really cool new data about the 2015 vulnerability, but your scan's returning a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have that data, it's not very useful in the decision-making context. The scores aren't any better, but the breakdowns of what goes into the scores have some really useful, really cool data in there. Cool. I will post this up, and I'm on Twitter if anybody wants to talk. This really specific branch of security that is all I know.